Welcome to today's magical story. Today, we will journey into the world of one of the most beloved fairy tales of all time, Snow White. Get cozy and let's begin. Snow White, a fairy tale by the Brothers Grimm. Once upon a time in the middle of winter, when the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, a queen sat by a window with a black ebony frame and sewed. As she sewed and looked out at the snow, she pricked her finger with the needle, and 3 drops of blood fell onto the snow. The red looked so beautiful against the white that she thought to herself, "If only I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of this frame." Soon after, she gave birth to a daughter who was as white as snow, as red as blood, and had hair as black as ebony. She was therefore named Snow White. When the child was born, the queen died. A year later, the king took another wife. She was a beautiful woman, but she was proud and arrogant and could not bear the thought that anyone might surpass her in beauty. She owned a magical mirror, and when she stood before it and looked at herself, she would say, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" And the mirror would reply, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." This pleased her, for she knew the mirror spoke the truth. Snow White, however, grew up and became more and more beautiful. By the time she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as the day and more beautiful than the queen herself. When the queen once again asked her mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen was horrified and turned yellow and green with envy. From that moment on, whenever she saw Snow White, her heart twisted with hatred. Jealousy and pride grew like weeds in her heart, and she had no peace day or night. She summoned a huntsman and said, "Take the child into the forest. I never want to see her again. Kill her, and as proof, bring me her lungs and liver." The huntsman obeyed and led Snow White into the forest. But when he drew his knife and was about to pierce her innocent heart, she began to cry and said, "Oh, dear huntsman, spare my life. I will run into the wild forest and never come home again." Because she was so beautiful, the huntsman took pity on her and said, "Run away then, poor child." He thought the wild animals would soon devour her, but it was as if a stone had been lifted from his heart because he didn't have to kill her. Just then, a young boar came running by, so he killed it, took its lungs and liver, and brought them to the queen as proof. The cook was ordered to prepare them, and the wicked queen ate them, believing she had consumed Snow White's lungs and liver. Now the poor child was all alone in the vast forest, and she was so frightened that she looked at every leaf on the trees and didn't know what to do. She began to run over sharp stones and through thorns, and wild animals passed her by but did her no harm. She ran as far as her feet could carry her until evening approached. Then she saw a little cottage and went inside to rest. Everything in the cottage was small but so neat and tidy that it was a joy to behold. There was a little table with a white tablecloth and 7 little plates, each with its own little spoon, fork, knife, and cup. Against the wall stood 7 little beds, each covered with snow white sheets. Snow White, who was hungry and thirsty, ate a little from each plate and drank a drop from each cup, not wanting to take everything from one. Afterward, because she was so tired, she tried to lie down in one of the beds, but none of them fit. One was too long, another too short, until finally, the 7th one was just right. She lay down in it, commended herself to God, and fell asleep. When it was completely dark, the owners of the cottage returned. They were the 7 dwarves who mined for ore in the mountains. They lit their 7 little lamps, and as the cottage grew bright, they saw that someone had been there, for everything was not as they had left it. The first dwarf said, "Who has been sitting in my chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my plate?" The third said, "Who has been eating my bread?" The fourth said, "Who has been eating my vegetables?" The fifth said, "Who has been using my fork?" The sixth said, "Who has been cutting with my knife?" The seventh said, "Who has been drinking from my cup?" Then the first dwarf looked around and saw that his bed had been disturbed. "Who has been lying in my bed?" he asked. The others came running and cried, "Someone has been lying in mine too." But the seventh dwarf, when he looked in his bed, saw Snow White lying there, asleep. He called the others, who came running and cried out in amazement. They fetched their 7 little lamps and shone them on Snow White. "Oh my goodness! Oh my goodness!" they exclaimed. "What a beautiful child!" They were so delighted that they didn't wake her but let her sleep in the bed. The seventh dwarf slept with his companions, 1 hour with each, and so the night passed. When morning came, Snow White awoke and was frightened when she saw the 7 dwarves. But they were friendly and asked, "What is your name?" "My name is Snow White," she replied. "How did you come to our house?" the dwarves asked. She told them how her stepmother had wanted her killed, but the huntsman had spared her life, and she had run through the forest until she found their cottage. The dwarves said, "If you will keep house for us, cook, make the beds, wash, sew, and knit, and keep everything neat and tidy, you may stay with us, and you shall want for nothing." "Yes," said Snow White, "with all my heart." And so she stayed with them. She kept their house in order. In the mornings, they went into the mountains to search for ore and gold, and in the evenings, they returned, and their meal had to be ready. The girl was alone all day, so the good dwarves warned her, "Beware of your stepmother. She will soon know you are here. Do not let anyone in." Meanwhile, the queen, believing she had eaten Snow White's lungs and liver, thought she was once again the most beautiful in the land. She stepped before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair, it's true, but Snow White, beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarves, is 1,000 times fairer than you." The queen was horrified, for she knew the mirror did not lie. She realized the huntsman had deceived her and that Snow White was still alive. She began to plot anew how to kill her, for as long as she was not the most beautiful in the land, envy gave her no peace. After much thought, she disguised herself as an old peddler woman, completely unrecognizable. In this guise, she crossed the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarves, knocked on the door and called, "Beautiful wares for sale, for sale!" Snow White looked out the window and said, "Good day, dear woman. What do you have to sell?" "Fine wares," the old woman replied, "laces of all colors," and she held up a brightly woven lace. Snow White thought, "I can let this honest woman in," so she unbolted the door and bought the pretty lace. "Child," said the old woman, "how you look. Come, let me lace you up properly." Snow White, suspecting nothing, stood before her and let her lace her up with the new lace. But the old woman laced her so tightly that Snow White could no longer breathe and fell down as if dead. "Now you have been the most beautiful," said the old woman, and hurried away. Not long after, in the evening, the 7 dwarves returned home. How shocked they were to find their dear Snow White lying on the ground, motionless, as if dead. They lifted her up and saw that she was laced too tightly, so they cut the lace. She began to breathe a little, and slowly came back to life. When the dwarves heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was none other than the wicked queen. Be on your guard, and do not let anyone in when we are not with you." The evil queen, when she returned home, went to her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied as before, "You, my queen, are fair. It's true, but Snow White, beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarves, is 1,000 times fairer than you." When she heard this, all the blood rushed to her heart, for she saw that Snow White was alive again. "Now," she said, "I will think of something that will destroy you." And with the witchcraft she knew, she made a poisoned comb. Then she disguised herself as a different old woman and went over the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarves. She knocked on the door and called, "Fine wares for sale!" For sale? Snow White looked out and said, "Go away! I cannot let anyone in." "Surely you can look," said the old woman, pulling out the poisoned comb and holding it up. The comb pleased the child so much that she was tempted and opened the door. When they had agreed on the price, the old woman said, "Now let me comb your hair properly." Poor Snow White, thinking nothing of it, let the old woman do as she pleased. But as soon as the comb touched her hair, the poison took effect, and the girl fell down unconscious. "You paragon of beauty," said the wicked woman, "now you are done for," and she left. Fortunately, it was almost evening, and the 7 dwarves soon returned home. When they found Snow White lying on the ground as if dead, they immediately suspected the stepmother. They searched and found the poisoned comb. As soon as they removed it, Snow White came back to life and told them what had happened. Once again, they warned her to be on her guard and not to let anyone in. The queen, back at home, stood before her mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied as before, "You, my queen, are fair. It's true, but Snow White beyond the mountains with the 7 dwarves is 1,000 times fairer than you." When the queen heard this, she trembled and shook with rage. "Snow White shall die," she cried, "even if it costs me my life." She went to a hidden secret chamber where no one ever went and made a poisoned apple. On the outside it was beautiful, white with red cheeks, so that anyone who saw it would desire it. But whoever ate even a small piece would die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and disguised herself as a peasant woman. Then she crossed the 7 mountains to the 7 dwarves. She knocked on the door, and Snow White stuck her head out the window and said, "I cannot let anyone in. The 7 dwarves have forbidden it." "That's all right with me," replied the peasant woman. "I'll get rid of my apples somehow. Here, I'll give you one." "No," said Snow White, "I cannot accept anything." "Are you afraid of poison?" said the old woman. "Look, I'll cut the apple in 2. You eat the red half, and I'll eat the white half." The apple, however, had been crafted so cleverly that only the red half was poisoned. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and when she saw the peasant woman eating her half, she could no longer resist. She reached out her hand and took the poisoned half. But as soon as she took a bite, she fell down dead. The queen looked at her with a cruel gaze and laughed loudly, saying, "White as snow, red as blood, black as ebony. This time, the dwarves cannot revive you." When she returned home and asked the mirror, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" the mirror finally replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest of all." At last her envious heart was at peace, as much peace as an envious heart can have. When the dwarves returned home that evening, they found Snow White lying on the ground, and no breath came from her mouth. She was dead. They lifted her up and searched for anything poisonous. They unlaced her, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine, but nothing helped. The dear child was dead and remained dead. They laid her on a bier, and all 7 sat by her and mourned her for 3 days. Then they wanted to bury her, but she still looked as fresh as a living person and still had her beautiful red cheeks. They said, "We cannot bury her in the black earth," so they made a transparent glass coffin so that she could be seen from all sides. They laid her inside and wrote her name on it in golden letters, along with the fact that she was a princess. Then they placed the coffin on the mountain, and one of them always stayed there to guard it. Animals also came to mourn Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and finally a dove. Snow White lay in the coffin for a long, long time and did not decay. She looked as if she were sleeping, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black-haired as ebony. One day, a prince happened to ride through the forest and came to the dwarves' cottage to spend the night. He saw the coffin on the mountain and the beautiful Snow White inside. He read what was written on it in golden letters. Then he said to the dwarves, "Let me have the coffin. I will give you whatever you want for it." But the dwarves replied, "We will not give it up for all the gold in the world." The prince said, Then give it to me as a gift, for I cannot live without seeing Snow White. I will honor and cherish her as my dearest." When he spoke these words, the good dwarves took pity on him and gave him the coffin. The prince had his servants carry it away on their shoulders. As they walked, they stumbled over a bush, and the jolt dislodged the piece of poisoned apple from Snow White's throat. Soon she opened her eyes, lifted the lid of the coffin, and sat up, alive once more. "Oh heavens, where am I?" she cried. The prince, overjoyed, said, "You are with me," and told her what had happened. He said, "I love you more than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my wife." Snow White agreed and went with him, and their wedding was celebrated with great splendor and magnificence. Snow White's wicked stepmother was also invited to the feast. When she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she stood before the mirror and asked, "Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the fairest of them all?" The mirror replied, "You, my queen, are fair. It's true. But the young queen is 1,000 times fairer than you." The evil woman cursed, and she was so terrified that she didn't know what to do. At first, she didn't want to go to the wedding, but she couldn't rest until she saw the young queen. When she arrived and recognized Snow White, she stood frozen with fear and could not move. But iron slippers had already been placed over a fire of coals and were brought in with tongs and set before her. She was forced to step into the red-hot shoes and dance until she fell down dead. And that's the story of Snow White. What did you think? Do you have a favorite fairy tale? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more magical stories. See you next time.